This evening, I propose to have a different focus for our study. Instead of continuing with the text of the synthesis of yoga, to take up a theme of discussion which we had begun earlier this morning with a group of scientists and doctors and healers visiting us from the United States. And we had a discussion about the difference of approach between current science and the approach of the yogic knowledge and the Vedic science. And in this difference, to recognize practical implications both for health and healing, as well as for our understanding of matter and physics and the possibilities which can emerge. In the discussion we had this afternoon, I had started with two important ideas which we can begin with here, and then we can explore further questions, queries as they come up from everybody who's present here, but especially from the group with which we had the discussion this afternoon. The first important idea was to look at reality not merely as one range of physical substance that gives rise to phenomena, but as an entire spectrum of substance, all of which are degrees of density of one underlying consciousness. So when you look at a flower, it is not merely the physical substance and molecules that your physical hands can touch, but there is also interpenetrating the physical reality of the flower, a subtler substance, in fact a series of subtler substances with which our own subtle body can interact and does interact, even if we are not conscious of it on the surface. You enter a room filled with plants and you feel a shift in your quality of energy. You feel yourself revitalized by the interaction that takes place between plant energy and your own energy. But if the plants were replaced by a perfect plastic replica, they would look the same, but they would not have the same result. And when you look at any substance in the universe, any object in the universe, we need to consider these subtler layers of substance which they consist of in order to be able to understand what that thing really is and what it does. Even taking a very ordinary looking physical reality of the physical earth, which we see only as a ball of soil and mud and water, if we look more deeply, there is a subtle body to the physical earth, and the subtle body itself has many levels, including what we may call the life body, the vital body of the earth, and a mental body of the earth, and even a spiritual body and identity. when we are able to perceive the spiritual identity, we may describe her as a conscious being and even name her as Mother Earth. Similarly, when you look at the sun, you could describe it in terms of the gases and the light that it emanates. The material substance is only its most exterior form, even as our physical body is the most exterior form of our consciousness, of which our mind is the most obvious reality for us. So too with the sun, there is an inner spiritual reality of a conscious being which presides over the sun's physical processes and its life processes, and its consciousness changing changes also the physical processes of the sun. Just as when our mind goes to sleep, the biological processes of the body also undergo a change, the body goes to sleep. And when the mind wakes up, is more active, it kickstarts the biology and leads the biology into a different rhythm of operation. So too the sun goes through its cycles of greater awakening or greater sleepiness, as would also a planet, as would in fact any object that we may see. Not all objects though may have the full spectrum of substance in their formation. A stone may have an energy body, may not necessarily have a mental body, at least not one which is developed. It may receive mental impressions, but not necessarily have an articulate mental life. A plant, similarly, will necessarily have a life energy body, which is its greater reality. Just as for us, mind is more important, for the plant, the sensation and life energy is more important. It may have a rudimentary or crude mental life, depending on the particular degree of evolution of various plants. There are some plants which are less mentally evolved, other plants which may be more mentally evolved. And the difference can be felt if we can tap into that layer of its reality. But in any case, the idea here is reality itself must be seen in the full spectrum of these gradations of substance. And more often than not, the higher gradation leads the lower. I said more often than not because it is not so in the less evolved forms. If you take a snake, for example, or a snail, many of the simple forms of fish may not have a richly developed mental life. And so it is the life instinct which is its primary reality and leads everything else. But in a more developed animal such as an elephant or a dolphin, the mental life is sufficiently developed that it can lead even its emotional and life instincts. So the evolution is basically building or organizing these levels of substance until that grade of life becomes sufficient in itself. Look at it this way. In the stone, evolution has formed only the physical body. In the plant, it has formed also the life body, the vital body. And subsequently in other animals, the mental body is also formed. In the human being, the mental body is sufficiently developed and individualized that our mind is able to articulate itself separate from the body, feels itself separate from the body. Again, in the more evolved human beings, this would be true. In the less evolved ones, the feeling itself would be, I am body, sometimes I think. And we would call them barbarians. But still, the evolution represents here the organization in subtler substances of the powers that belong properly to that grade of consciousness. So in the human mind, for example, the powers natural to the cosmic mind have been organized in an individual space. In a substance which is a part of the cosmic mental substance, but here accumulated and structured to be able to survive or operate as an individual separate unit. In the same way as our life energy is part of the universal life energy, here organized in a whirl that is repeating itself to create a sense of, a semblance of a separate individuality. drawing from the universe where needed, throwing out into the universe its waste material. And the same system is reflected in our gross physical body, where we are also taking food from the universe of a physical density and throwing out the waste from the physical body. So what you see here is in the universe, all of these gradations of substance, and then the individualization that's taking place beginning with matter, and in evolution, successively all the higher levels being organized and individualized. Now the human mind is our highest organized consciousness. There are higher levels though that exist not organized. Among them particularly what we will call the intuitive consciousness. It exists, it's always there supporting the mind's operations, but it has not been organized sufficiently that the intuitive powers can be accessed and worked upon directly. So what you experience is the normal functioning of the mind, the support of the intuition behind, and every now and then when the mind gets a little frustrated and gets stunned momentarily or becomes quiet, a little bit of the intuition reflecting into it. But our spiritual evolution would actually involve a substance of the intuitive consciousness being organized until it develops an individuality in its working. And then we consciously would be able to be conscious in the intuitive awareness and be able to operate with all the powers natural to the intuitive consciousness. Sri Aurobindo makes reference to the yogic tradition that we have 5 bodies, and these are the 5 levels or gradations of the cosmos, the physical, vital, mental, and then above that the supramental and the bliss. There are 2 more, remember it's 7 principles, there are 2 more where the body is not even formed. But these 2 above the 3, the top 2, which represent our spiritual life, there is a vague, almost like a halo of a body, but it has not been organized. What is above that doesn't even exist. But this halo, which is sufficiently existent merely as a support, is the access that we have for our spiritual life. And as with the intuition which we discussed earlier, something of its influence reflects in the individual consciousness. Whenever we choose to become quiet, or whenever we are stunned by a shock of life and the normal machinery cannot operate, something of that influence either reflects or leaks through to give to us the momentary uplift of the spiritual experience. So the first correction to our worldview is to begin to see things in all of these levels as interpenetrating influences. The evolution is greater when the higher leads the lower. The evolution is lesser when the lower dominates and restricts the higher development. Sri Aurobindo explains this in this way, that in the cosmic consciousness you have all these levels of consciousness, each operating with its own characteristic tendency, but the whole purpose of the individual is to organize these to reverse now the influence, take charge, and bring the higher to lead the lower rather than lower seeming to create the higher. And so this is the very essence of our spiritual development, to become conscious of the higher and then to recast the lower in terms of the higher. So this is one aspect. The second aspect which we touched upon is to begin to see form from a different perspective. As it appears to us, the flower is red because the light that came upon it was absorbed in certain colors and reflected in certain colors. The other flower is yellow because it reflected a different flower. When we begin to observe why it reflects or absorbs, we discover there are certain molecules, certain arrangements of matter, of atoms, of electrons, protons and neutrons, which have the property of absorbing certain colors and reflecting others. Why? It's not obvious, but somehow it does it. We begin to classify them. This absorbs this light, that reflects We only classify what we have observed, but we do not explain. To say that's the same bundle of protons, electrons, neutrons, differently arranged, create complex phenomena is difficult to accept, because the gap between the complexity of the phenomena and the simplicity of the electron, proton, neutron is so much that instinctively, intuitively, we know that this cannot be. There's something missing in this idea. But still, we map it out. And then we try to explain, how would this happen? Why does it happen? And in practice, most of modern physics is observation which has been described and then declared as a law when we find it to be consistent. And when in quantum physics we find certain things to be almost chaotic or driven more by chance, we again make a equation around that chance behavior and declare that as a law, and nowhere have we explained at any stage why it's happening and what is actually happening. But in the approach of the Vedic physics or the Vedic science, we look at the forms of atoms or molecules, their geometry, their numbers, different from the qualities that they emanate. We cannot explain, for example, in physics, why adding one electron to a substance changes completely the character of the substance. Or another example that Sri Aurobindo gives, if you take hydrogen and oxygen and combine them, you have a material which has no characteristic of hydrogen, no characteristic of oxygen. It is completely different. It's a new thing. And yet it seems to be composed of these two. Decompose them and you get back the hydrogen and oxygen, again with completely different properties. What in the arrangement is giving rise to these different properties? Well, we don't know. So in the Vedic physics, we begin to look at these two things separately. There is number, there is structure, geometry, design, and then there is quality and property, and they're different. The two relate in terms of consciousness to the Sat and the Chit Shakti. The underlying existence is what contains or expresses itself through and as form and number and geometry. And the energy, conscious energy which is flowing, expresses itself in the play of quality and properties. So when we look at this light reflecting from the flower to give this color, if we go deep into the form of the flower, after decomposing all the electrons, protons and neutrons and subatomic particles, what we find is an underlying energy. An energy whirling. And in its whirl, somehow, it makes certain light frequencies reflect, absorb certain light frequencies. How? Why? And it's not obvious. But then we can question, is the underlying reality the energy itself, or was it the particle? Now when you see a particle, you see arrangements, proportions, numbers. But when you see energy, you do not see arrangements and numbers. You see only quality and properties. If I look at an electron, how do I know it's an electron? Because if I shoot another electron at it, it bounces back with a certain force. If I shoot another particle, it bounces in a different way with a different force. And so this bundle of properties of repulsion and attraction is my definition of an electron. If you question this deeply enough, you realize you actually never see a particle. You never know a particle. When your finger touches the table, it's only the electric repulsion between so-called particles, which is the pressure that you sense. Nothing ever touches anything. Was there ever a particle? We can never be sure. We conceive of the particle because that's how our mind wants to believe the underlying reality of things. But it could just as well be a bundle of energy putting out a bundle of qualities. That is your particle, isn't it? So when you'll begin to look at things this way, the working of nature is seen to be purely conscious or semi-conscious energy, flowing in patterns and putting out certain bundles of qualities and properties, which to our mind observation gives the impression of particles and arrangements and geometric proportions and numbers. In fact, there may be only one mass of an ocean of energy flowing in particular ways, throwing out certain qualities. And when we begin to see this, we get a glimpse of the rationale for why certain arrangements give rise to certain qualities, or why we associate that arrangement inside the quality when we observe the quality. This is the basis also of much of the occult science, where you cease to bother with molecular structures, you look rather at the quality of energy that things represent or contain. The fact that an object reflects red light and absorbs all other light is a certain bundle of qualities which corresponds precisely with everything else that manifests as red, including larger bodies of energy such as the planet Mars, which is also a conscious being, and its particular quality of expression resonates with this vibration that is red. Now, if you want to invoke that particular energy of Mars or the deity representing it, then you would create a space that is full of red color, for example. And the fact that this resonates with that is what evokes or invokes that particular vibration or that particular presence. And so the basis of much of the occult science is looking at these natural relations, resonances or connections based on quality, taking small things which have qualities that you want to assemble in relation to the larger qualities, playing with their arrangement here, and therefore either invoking, evoking or modifying things out there. There's a very interesting incident which is narrated in a book called Rolling Thunder, which is a description of an Native American healer, and he takes the stink beetle, and says that this has an innate affinity to the processes of lightning in the sky. And so he flips over this beetle and tickles its belly. And the author of the book observes how each time he tickles the belly with a feather, there's a lightning shooting across the sky. It's as if here you're moving your feather and there you're producing the spark. How is that possible? And if you look at molecular structures as the underlying reality, well, there's no connection between that structure and this structure. But if you look at energy and quality that energy expresses as the underlying reality, this resonates with that, and it's a natural link in the underlying oneness of the universe, which holds everything one together anyway. In that oneness, things which are similar in consciousness or quality have a natural affinity and are close, therefore, in energy. And so, although physically separate, you can tickle the beetle here and play with the lightning there. Or, in more complex rituals, you will use certain sounds, certain words, or visuals, ideas which will be invoked with combinations again with physical objects to evoke or invoke a particular presence. I shared my experience many years ago when in the Ganesh temple in Pondicherry they had to go through the ritual of purifying the idol and re-imprinting the spiritual presence, and they had set up an elaborate system of 4 sections representing the 4 Vedas. Each of these sections had different rituals, but the main one which the head priest explained to me was the one where they were assembling the powers of Ganesh. Now Ganesh as a conscious being has also certain aspects of his action in the world, powers or tools or weapons depending on the vocabulary one uses, how he acts through the power of knowledge to cut through difficulties and get to the other side, and he has specific powers or aspects, sometimes represented as weapons or arms. And so for this particular reason, they had different fire centers, yagya kundas, into which that particular aspect was invoked, and then it was transferred one after another in a sequence all the way into the pot of water which was in the center, until they had assembled all the different aspects of Ganesh into that pot. And then the priest said, then once we have him, we take him and pour him on the idol to make a final transference and establish that presence in the idol. Until then, the idol is just a piece of metal or stone or whatever substance. When you have brought the life, the spiritual force into it, then we treat it as a conscious being thereafter. But he said, to take it across, they carried it on their head. And he said, when they take it on the head, they lose all awareness of themselves, and it is Ganesha which leads their body. They are no more themselves, often they are not conscious of who they are. So I asked him, what does it feel like when you take it on your head? And there were two priests, the head priest and his second in command, and they looked at each other and smiled mysteriously. And then one of them looked at me and said, it feels like the sun is lit up in your heart. So these are very vivid and very objective even experiences that one can have through these processes. And they were given as mechanical tools through which you could relate to and invoke higher levels of consciousness to build a temple. This is the basic difference between an occult structure and a spiritual structure. An occult structure has a whole mechanism and a technology with which you invoke, hold, and purify the consciousness which is invoked, and you have to stay strictly with it. Whereas the spiritual structure is a conscious invocation with no occult prior base required. The difference between the two also is that the occult structure will be very specific in what it invokes and holds. The spiritual center will invoke the divine consciousness and may hold multiple aspects. In fact, potentially it can hold all infinite possibilities of the divine consciousness and can be met by different people in different ways because it holds an aspect or the multiplicity of the divine itself in that concentration. I gave the example of the Matrimandir as a spiritual structure where no special rituals were required. The mother's guidance was build the Matrimandir, and I take it upon myself to make it one of the most powerful centers in the world. And so as the construction was built, those of you who have worked with it, you know, you could feel a shift taking place. And when the final construction was completed, you could feel the build-up rapidly increasing. And even now it continues. It's as if over time the concentration is densifying and amplifying itself and spreading. The third important idea we have here is, let's look at the implications of this, because the moment you begin to look at energy and quality of energy as the most important, many things which seemed strange earlier become now obvious. In the human body itself, for example, every organ has a particular process that it looks after. And the process can be described in terms of its qualities. What does it do and how does it act upon whatever comes to meet it? The stomach takes material and breaks it down, extracts from it, and throws out what it does not want, for example. And you can see this as a process and particular qualities that it is applying in that process. The heart similarly has the process or the quality of drawing in from outside and then pushing out again, circulating energy, circulating, making sure everything is moving in circulation, and particularly pushing forward physically the energy even as molecules of nourishment. But when you now step back from the gross physical body and look at the subtler layers of which we spoke of first, we notice on each of these layers there is a different operation, or the nature of the operation becomes more abstract, more essential. So the physical heart is doing the physical pumping, but the energy behind is not physically pushing out, it's more a flow and a rhythmic flow. Behind that, in the mental body, is no more energy but idea. And the idea which holds the relationship of the heart with the rest of the body, it becomes more essential, more abstract. And still behind that there can be something more essential, of which all of these are progressively denser representations. So going back, when you come to something more essential, if on the surface something is damaged, the essential becomes the template upon which the reconstruction of the surface damage form can take place. So immediately behind the gross physical body is the subtle physical, which substantially has the same density as the gross body, but is much more fluid, elastic, and holds the ideal form of the body. When you see a person's subtle physical body, you see them as they were in their prime, whatever their conception of themselves in their prime is. When you leave the physical body after death, your subtle body, when first seen, sometimes you see them at the same age as they were just after death, but often when you see them in dream or in vision, you see their younger form. Because that's the natural way they conceive of themselves to be, and the shape of the body is that. But that was the template which was supporting the gross physical body. And to the extent that that is supporting and its influence is strong, the gross body retains its youth. To the extent that that support is weak, the gross body can continue to degenerate, and the subtle body still retains the template but with weaker and weaker influences, until the separation is so great that the gross body can no more continue on its own, and it's dropped like a clothing, and you remain in the subtle body, and the rest of the process, post-death process, continues. You don't die, you only shed the body. But this layering is critical to our understanding, because on each layer there is something more essential and more free, but also more freely connected with the universe, more plastic, more able to receive influences from outside and bring them into the limited form on the surface. So one of the things which happens as our consciousness grows is we develop this ability to access these deeper inner layers more freely, and through them bring possibilities which were currently not organized in our most physical surface form. That process of bringing forward new possibilities is our growth, is our evolution. Everything that we evolve into is actually waiting and held behind in our subtler and deeper layers, waiting to come out. So seen in this way, the mother explains that we have already in our subtle body all of the possibilities that are meant to be eventually developed here. But because of the gap in between, the little bit that leaks out is what makes for our normal life, and when something exceptional leaks out, it makes for our exceptional genius or special powers of life. But this being the relationship, we can understand how sometimes in certain altered states we have access to extraordinary knowledge. Or some people who have a defect in the brain, or by accident have damaged some part of the physical brain, suddenly now express genius capabilities. They are called child savants, and they seem to have access to knowledge. There's one example of a person who has the skill of making with his fingers any form in clay. You can tell him the name of any animal and he will construct a perfect, beautiful form of it. He has never seen any of those animals. You say kangaroo, he has never seen it, but he makes one. You say pterodactyl, he has never seen one, but he makes it. Somehow he is able to access what you mean when you speak the word, and without ever being trained, make this perfect form. But otherwise, he seems to be retarded in certain ways in his mental capacities. So these are aberrations which unfortunately current science looks at as some power of the brain released by the accident, but in fact it's the reverse. It's rather the brain's limitation now removed and the deeper things from within leaking out more directly, but in a way which is unbalanced, not organized, making for this oddity. There's a very interesting observation Sri Aurobindo makes, that currently there's an enormous push of nature to accelerate evolution, and the result is that nature is trying to push the boundaries of the human mind, but into a domain which is not yet organized by her. She does not have enough means to make that breakthrough. And so there are in the process often mistakes or defects in the effort. And these appear as unbalanced genius. But the fact that they're unbalanced does not mean genius needs to be unbalanced. It's just an unbalanced development. But eventually and increasingly, the genius capacity has to emerge so that what was genius 100 years ago will be the norm eventually, and so on. But all of these powers of genius are already there within the inner mind. And often it is through hypnosis that we are able to tap into these domains. Unusually, under hypnosis, anybody who's taken deep enough seems to have access to this kind of unusual capacity or knowledge. And on return from the hypnotic state, you seem to lose it. You seem to have access to extraordinary memory. For example, under deep hypnotic state, you could be asked, how many breaths have you taken since you woke up this morning? Something which you have never consciously noted and you could not have even watched. And yet under hypnosis, you will be able to say exactly what it is. Or even give access to knowledge which is far away that you may never know things about. What's happening in your home right now when you're away from your home, and you could describe accurately. It's as if in that deeper state we have access to all knowledge in the universe. And this tells you something very important. It means our current evolution has so much more waiting still to evolve even in the domain of mind. And all of these represent powers waiting in the inner subliminal levels of our mind, waiting to come out into the conscious, organized surface mind, which is the movement of evolution. So this is the second, the implication of this knowledge of the qualities being dominant, and looking at the qualities on different levels gives you this an extraordinary insight. But most importantly now, you can create resonances between these qualities. So if you have a plant which has a particular vibrational quality, you can bring that plant to your body, eat it or apply it, and those subtler gradations of vibrations would act on your body to heal or change whatever it is that they would do. So even in the medication, we recognize there are these subtler levels which are acting on subtler levels within us. How far does this go? And Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting observation. He says, with medicine, it is not so much the medicine itself, but the faith we have in the medicine and in the doctor, which leads to the healing. And if the doctor does not himself have faith in the medicine, or if you do not have faith in the medicine, we find the medicine rarely works. This principle is described as the placebo effect. And much of modern medicine tries to remove the placebo effect because it is seen as an aberration. In one study, they discovered that almost 80% of the problems we have daily, for which we go to doctors, can be cured by placebo. That is, you believe that you have been given the right medicine and you get well. But that's not enough, Sri Aurobindo says. There is, of course, the physical action of the medicine. There is the particular action of the doctor who gives the medicine with a certain will and intention. That also is a major component in the medicine and its effectivity. And there is, above that, a factor X, which is the particular spiritual energy that one may invoke into it, which is often the most decisive in these kinds of, especially in the more dramatic cures. I have shared perhaps long ago the incident we have here recorded in the ashram of one of the doctors. He was Dr. Ramchandra, he was a homeopath, and he had a reputation for miraculous cures. And someone in the local French embassy was on the deathbed. All medicine had failed, and he was dying. The priest had come and begun to recite prayers. And they said, well, let's give a last-ditch attempt, call Dr. Ramchandra. So the fellow comes, examines the patient, pulls out homeopathic medicine, pops it into the patient's mouth, and then boldly declares, in 1 hour, either he will die or he will be completely cured. Very dramatic. And then he walks out. And exactly 1 hour later, the patient gets up, completely healed, completely cured, and now he's feeling fine. So they ask the doctor, what do we do? Should he rest for a few days? And the doctor says, no, he can get on with his life. And it was such a miraculous cure that the allopaths in the ashram began to write to Sri Aurobindo. One of them said, if this is true, then we should all abandon allopathy and stick to homeopathy. And Sri Aurobindo says, no, it's not the pathy. Every pathy catches a particular line of working of nature, and it's a specialized line, but it's not so much the pathy, but these other factors, and particularly the factor X he points to. Now, what was factor X in case of Dr. Ramchandra? We have his correspondence with Sri Aurobindo, where he writes in his letters. He says, today I had such and such a patient, and I gave such and such a medicine, and I prayed to you and felt your force at this time. And he puts the time. And so a series of letters of this kind where he mentions how in invoking the spiritual force, he receives distinctly the action of the force as he gives the medicine, and he notes the time. In one of the letters, he writes this, but does not note the time, and in the margin, Sri Aurobindo writes the time. It's amazing. So Sri Aurobindo was conscious of this invocation and made him aware that he knew what was happening. And that was the reason, the factor X, which led to these kinds of dramatic and miraculous cures. So this is one of the interesting implications of this aspect. There are many others, and one of the implications of the idea of patterns of qualities of energy is that you can imprint a quality of energy. So if you have developed a skill in your consciousness, you can imprint that skill into another person. Or you can absorb a skill from another person by dwelling in consciousness on his consciousness or skill, and as if absorbing or receiving from him this. Now, in fact, this is exactly how all knowledge gets transmitted from person to person, even in an ordinary classroom situation in the school. When a teacher may be explaining things on the blackboard with books and everything else, the normal paraphernalia, the students who most align in consciousness to feel and sense what the teacher is feeling and thinking are the ones who catch it most easily. If they have an intuitive turn, they are able to identify and absorb the idea even before it is fully articulated, and they say, yes, I got it. And this is in fact how it is happening even in little children when they look to their parents almost like gods and spontaneously want to imitate. The imitation itself comes from an identification in consciousness that what the parents do, their energy in identification with the parents now follows. So much is transmitted through such means, not only energetically but in the imprint of thought. If you look back at your formal training, you cannot explain all the knowledge that you have, particularly use of words, the meaning of words that you have in your experience. You have never had somebody read out from a dictionary the meaning of all the words that you had. You've never had them all explained. Most of them you picked up in context. Especially words which have to do with highly subjective feelings. When the parent says, this is dangerous. What is dangerous? As a concept, it's too abstract for the child. But somehow the vibe of the parent saying this is dangerous, this vibe of fear or the shrinking that is involved with it, the child absorbs as an experience, dangerous. This experience this is dangerous. And now begins to use that word when he relates to that particular vibration of consciousness. So in fact, this is how all transmission actually takes place. Everything else is only an assistance to this direct transmission of consciousness. So when we speak of qualities as being prior to quantity and form, it opens a whole new dimension and a whole new approach to understanding things. And if you take, for example, an illness in the body, a person is feeling cold, you could look at the bugs, you could look at the viruses, you could look at the imbalance of hormones. Any of these could be causes for the shivering. But instead of looking at the structure of the relationships which make for this illness, you could simply look at the quality. You're feeling cold, let me give you a heating substance. And I give him something which is heating the system, and very quickly the person is healed. What did we do? We never looked at molecular structures or interactions of molecules. We looked at what quality this substance evokes in the body and countering the current imbalance in quality of experience of consciousness or energy. And so much of the traditional medicine is based on this kind of an understanding. Conscious energy being the basis of every form and every living thing, that becomes the base on which you assess the value of an object. So the Ayurvedic physician in his training is taught to sense to whatever degree he can. The masters are the ones who can take any plant and feel what bundle of energy or qualities it represents. And if they are sufficiently spiritually developed, they meet the being presiding over the plant. And the being tells them, not words, but an imprint of experience. You will recall a similar experience that the mother had when she was in Japan, and she went to see the cherry blossoms in full bloom, and it was in spring. I think it was the cherry blossoms. And the plant reached out to her and said, here, take these, and this has the cure for all the illnesses of spring. And it gave her that knowledge of how to use what it was giving for curing the illnesses of spring. And this is how the ancients actually developed this kind of knowledge, not by experimentation as we do today with blind experimentation, but by this kind of an intuitive experience of the thing itself revealing its power. So this is an important part of the discussion which we had earlier. There is a third aspect to this whole question, which is the fact that every object in the universe is the whole universe representing a special front. This little red flower is the whole universe putting up a special quality of the whole in front. The garland itself is the whole universe putting forward a special representation of itself, and so on. When this holographic nature of the universe is seen, we don't say this represents that, this is that, putting forward a special front. It opens the way for something extraordinary. Like earlier I said, you tickle the bug here and it changes things in the universe because it is that, but the reverse is true. Everything out there is also represented here, and by studying this we can understand that. By studying that we can understand this. And in particular, within us, the human being being the whole, perhaps one of the most complete representations of the cosmos, everything that's out there is here. And for the human body to be healthy, it needs a little bit of everything that's out there. So the more diverse your ingestion of spectrum of energies, qualities, the more rich and healthy you are going to be. The more narrow, the more unbalanced will be your health, and so on. But this absorption can be done not only through physical means, but also directly through energetic means, which makes for most very healthy people. They have this innate ability to absorb what they need directly, and even if they seem to eat very little, they always seem to be full and well nourished and energetic. But this relationship is extremely important and holds a deep spiritual truth. Not only we are the universe is conscious of what we are, and the universe is waiting for us to awaken, because it is through us that the universe finds its fulfillment in the spiritual awakening. And here we see the relationship of the individual with the universal. Many individuals, each representing the universe uniquely, meeting together to create and participate as co-creators in the whole birth of new possibilities, and so on. So these are just some interesting insights which I bring forward as a base for further discussion, and I would like to invite your questions and comments freely. Yes. Mm-hmm.
In Western physics, we have certain basic principles and assumptions. revision given the context of our conversation. For example, we assume that the laws of physics are invariant, they're the same everywhere, at all times. Principles of conservation of energy, momentum,
Yes.
conservation of
Yes.
charge, principles of least action, and so on and so forth. So we see that there is a need to progress further, and we're on that journey now, which is, of course, very exciting. Now, when you talk about qualities giving rise to form and quantity, for example, divine energy giving rise to change that we perceive here on the physical plane, this sounds very similar to a set of invariants or a set of
Exactly.
universal principles.
Yes.
So rather than asking a question, I just ask you to comment on this, perhaps expand it
Yes.
larger, broader.
Yes. Sri Aurobindo has a fascinating discussion on this whole theme in a chapter on the life divine, in the life divine, where he discusses how we see in evolution, first of all, out of what appears to be randomness, things emerge which are non-random. And then in what emerges, there seem to be very distinct types around which there is infinite variation. And how do you explain all this? And so he takes this whole discussion to this deeper level where he shows how the spirit manifesting itself, when it chooses to express, because the whole universe is an expression of itself, what it wills becomes inevitable. But when it has to act out, when it has to take form, it works through a process. And that process seems to be common everywhere. And so it seems to be invariant. And yet what it represents through that process is itself and an aspect of its infinite freedom. And each form therefore has slight variations representing its infinite freedom.
The process itself
Yes. Has an invariance because it's acting on the whole universe in one go. So we do see things which are as if invariant everywhere in the universe, but need they be so all through time? Need not, perhaps. Perhaps that invariance is a starting point upon which, in the complete freedom of the spirit, it may even change rhythms in the universe. The universe itself may go through phases where now new possibilities now begin to kick in. So considering especially when you look at the levels of substance, invariance is common in the physical, where the rigidity of form is which is the characteristic of matter. Rigidity and form. The moment you shift one level up, you don't have any more rigidity, and as you go higher up, form itself becomes more and more fluid until it becomes something abstract and essential. And so the truth of this invariance is here, but as you go higher up, the invariance itself becomes more and more essential. Sri Aurobindo uses this term, real idea, which is the common feature of all roses, is the concept of rose, which includes all variations possible to the rose. But that concept is as if drawn out as one of the powers or one of the conceptions of the creative consciousness and imprinted in the whole cosmos. So everywhere that it begins to express itself, there will be variations in the form, but the thing behind supporting it is one invariant real idea. And so when you begin to look at the universe this way, yes, you find underlying real ideas which are the invariants and then all the variations of its expression which it holds.
So there can be an invariance on the water
Yes,
level.
yes,
It's
yeah,
possible.
yes. Yeah.
Can you learn things of somebody who has passed away?
Yes. Can you learn things from someone who has passed away? Mother mentions, I think it is the hands of which musician? Mozart, I think. Mozart's hands had become so conscious, and the individuation of that consciousness was so developed that even after he left the physical body, the consciousness of the hands remains as an imprint in the universe. And one can actually invoke that, receive it, and receive its imprint. Yes. So whatever has happened, even if it's in the past, is present in the totality of Brahman and is accessible. Including things not happened is also accessible. Yes. Feel free.
Okay, can I ask for, are you ready for questions before? My question would be, in our integral yoga, which place can healing, not our own healing, but doing healing to somebody else play? Because there I'm always confused, especially when it comes to invoking some
Yes.
passed away healer or something like that.
Healing, you mean as an act of helping others, not for oneself. Okay. So in any form of, well, first of all, we should be always available to serve, because our identity includes the universe, and to serve is one of the means. But not everybody may find themselves inclined to that particular kind of service. Each one serves through that means which is most natural to their temperament, to their nature. And especially when one gets into the domain of healing, your physical type makes a huge difference. If your body is not strong, then in entering in relation with people who have sick bodies, you can easily catch an infection. Or your ability to help by giving support is limited to the band which is strong in your consciousness. So now I've met healers who have a very dense physical body, and their energy is also of a very dense grade. And they will be excellent for certain types of illnesses, but not effective for illnesses which have a more subtle mental or higher emotional cause or not, because they can't access, they don't live there. But they're very good for dense, gross body illnesses. On the other hand, healers who are more naturally refined in their consciousness with not necessarily such a strong physical base may be able to help on that level, but if they face somebody who's very sick on a physical level, they may get overwhelmed or may even catch an illness and things like that. So one has to be conscious of one's own limits and the natural turn of your temperament. As long as you're conscious, you'll find your way. Yes.
While we're on the topic of healing, and well, let's say we work on a particular person, or we notice this also in our own field. We've spoken a lot about the different bodies, and we did mention it in that, but I would like to explore this further, because often what we find is what I would call a mental formation in the body, if you want to call it that. So we Westerners have been saying, using the term biofeeling, of course,
Yes.
lots of people are asking us exactly what do we mean by that.
Right.
It's limited in its scope.
Yes.
These days, when I'm reflecting on what that term is, I don't think of it anymore as just the vital body. I think of it as really, it's a combination of
Exactly.
an interacting system
Yes.
that includes the interactions of conditioned mental formations, which the healer also works on.
Yes.
So it's not so much that we're just working on the mental body, we're just working on the vital. Does that resonate with you?
Absolutely, absolutely. The problem is when you're dealing with conventional scientists who begin with a reductionist worldview that matter is all, you have to use a vocabulary that is acceptable to them. And so to speak of bioenergetic field, what's it saying? Body, energy, field. What's the big deal? But because it's a vocabulary accessible to them, you're able to reach out to them. But what are you talking about by body, energy, field? What is a field, in fact? Even if you go into the physics, what's an electric field or a magnetic field, physics does not tell you what it is. They treat it as a mathematical abstraction. In the same space in healing, you speak of field. It's like an influence which is extending of an energy which is somehow associated with your body. That's all you're saying. No big deal. What that influence is, of course, all these levels. and it's a mix of all of them. It's a complex mix. But if this vocabulary allows you to interact with conventional scientists, well, why not use it? And then, yes, and then you can, as you go along, of course, in our own approach, we have to begin to recognize the bioenergetic field itself has many gradations and densities, and at different levels it has different characteristics and so on.
A different question, but also related to the energy field. Would you say the concept of Sukshma Sharir, which I understand to be
Just subtle body.
subtle body,
Yeah.
is the same thing as what is termed as Pranamaya Kosha? Or is that
So again, just saying Sukshma Sharir is saying subtle body, it would include all these levels.
okay.
And when you pick a specific level, then you will name it and say this is the vital body, mental body, or subtle physical body.
So Sukshma Sharir
The subtle includes all these levels. Yeah, yeah. In reality, all of these levels are not so distinct. They are a continuum of gradations of substance, but where properties become distinctly different as you go through the scale. It's like the analogy of the atmosphere. So when you look at the Earth's atmosphere, as you go higher up, there is a stage after which the properties become so distinct that you have to give different names to those levels, all the way to the ionosphere and even beyond. In the water, similarly, the ocean may be one continuum all the way to the base, but there are distinct levels where temperature changes enough that the sonar vibration will reflect off it. And you have to treat it as a different layer, give it a different name if necessary. So the same thing happens. Consciousness itself is one continuum of densities, but the distinction becomes so clear at some point that you give it a different name. But also recognize, because they are all fitting into each other, each influences the other. So in Sri Aurobindo's vocabulary, we find something interesting. There's the physical body, vital body, and mental body. But then each influencing the other, interpenetrating, makes for all three within each of them. So there is something which may be called the mental physical. That is, the nature of it is the physical body, but turning to mind. Similarly, a vital physical, the physical body turning to life energy. In the vital body, there will be a physical vital, the part of the vital which embeds itself, leans down to embed into the gross physical, but is not fully in it, but has the characteristic of it. And there will be a mental vital. And similarly in the mind, which is much more our domain of conscious awareness, there is the physical mind, a vital mind, and the mental mind. And we know this very clearly in our experience, in the working of our mind which attaches itself to the body. I am feeling cold, warm, comfortable, uncomfortable. I want to make myself more comfortable. And the whole obsession of mind attaching itself to body and feeling itself as body is the physical mind. And the vital mind is the part of mind attaching itself to emotion and being emotion. I am the anger, I am the love, I am. And that's really mind that feels itself attached to this. And then there's the part of the mind that stands back from both and thinks in abstract terms, why am I here on earth? It has nothing to do with the body or emotions. It is thought turning upon thought itself, and that's the mental mind. So you have 9 levels, if you look at it this way, and the complex interpenetration between these. The gross body, physical body, yes. It has all these 3 sub-levels. We spoke in our discussion yesterday about 7 gradations, in fact, in the Ayurvedic tradition, 7 gradations of physical substance. But you see clearly in the way the gross body is formed, the bones representing the most rigid part, the muscle representing the kinesis in the body, and the nerves representing the mind processes in the body. And you could make further splits between these also. So it's a rich interplay of 7 principles working within all 7, working within all 7, working within them, unending reflecting as a fractal, creating all these levels and complex play.
Thank you for all of the day today and this conversation. When we are supporting someone with a serious illness, if it's an advanced some other really serious illness. And this, if it's a client, a patient, a loved one, they are doing everything they can from a truly integrated approach, the best medical approach, the best spiritual, integrated, using all the different healing techniques. And the condition continues to worsen. And we're praying for them. Just want to hear from you, how can we best serve while we're doing the best we can, and we're doing, again, with the patient and
Yes. It would depend on the cause of the worsening condition, and there can be many. I'll just look at a few most obvious. It could be that somewhere internally, the root cause of the illness has not yet been tapped. And it may have a psychological root or even a physical root, poisoning coming through water, for example, triggering off a chain reaction. So that may be the most obvious form. There may be a more deep psychological cause that the person has not overcome some deep innate sense of futility and helplessness, a conviction that they have to fall ill and that they are incurable. And that root may not have been so far reversed. And this is a critical element in any healing, the faith. And the word faith in English is too weak a word. In Sanskrit it is Shraddha, which resolves into the two root sounds, Shrat meaning essential truth, Dha holding, clinging. Clinging to what is your essential truth. That's the nature of the true faith. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Shri Krishna says, that which is your faith is what you become. If I'm convinced innately that I am sick, well, I will become sick. If I'm convinced innately that I am healthy or I will get well, it will kickstart the process. But this faith itself can exist on many levels. The mind will say, yeah, I know I have to get well, I want to get well. But in the body there may be the conviction, this weakness, this helplessness, I could never recover from it. The body feels it. And that may be the cause for the decline. And you need to then assess where it is that the weakness leading to the decline is, and then be able to help reverse that. And again, as we saw earlier, the impression of consciousness works. You as a doctor can put a counter faith to their negative faith. If you feel in yourself that conviction, this will be cured and healed, and are able to transmit it, you will find the person immediately beginning to improve. Except when you have gone away, they tend afterwards to lapse back into their old faith, especially when the energy drops. Oh, I can never recover from this, and so I'll let myself collapse. And the moment the doctor comes, oh yeah, I feel so much better. Yes, I know I will get well. There's this shift constantly. So it's a struggle between two innate faiths. And that's why the spiritual faith or deeper conviction emerging would be the one which could change these. And then there could be the final reason that the soul may have already decided to leave. And if that is the case, then you have to assist that transition while still providing the palliative care, minimize the intrusions of the medical system, and prepare the person for the transition itself to whatever extent you can within their framework of belief.
And in that case, you say something about how can we best deal with that grief, that sadness, when a loved one, if it's again a patient, client, or a family member, loved one, we know that it's time that they're leaving.
Yes. There are two aspects to the sadness of a loved one leaving. The first is our understanding of what it means that they died. And this is a major correction which we need to make. We never die. Nobody dies. They shed the body, they transition to a different level of experience, they never die. So what is it that I was relating to? Was I relating to the body of the person? Yes, the body has died. Then I can be unhappy. The person has not died. Should you be unhappy? And you will find in yourself this split, because in fact so much of our human relationships are instinctively built on the body relation. Here is the person, here is the energy I receive from them, here is the bundle of impression that I relate to, which is the person for me. But if I can consciously shift my relationship, especially at that time, to the person inhabiting the body, and recognize and feel that person, then it minimizes this sense of loss. Even that is easy in the first few days just after the person has shed the body, because in their subtle body they're still close to the earth vibration. You can still feel them energetically. But once they cross that boundary, often 10 to 15 days on, you do not feel them energetically except occasionally. When you remember this strongly, it's like they've come close, you feel their energy. But then they've gone. That's when you begin to feel the hollowness, the vacuum of the connection. And that brings grief. So there, it's really a problem of your instinct. What has happened is we have built an energy bond, especially with people close to us. It's an umbilical. Just as there's a physical umbilical at birth, there's a psychological umbilical which never gets cut. I have the extraordinary example of my teacher Panditji's sister when she was about 90, that she was sick, she was in bed. Her daughter was sick in a hospital in another city. She had practically forgotten about her daughter. She was living in her own very beautiful state. And then one day suddenly she said, I feel as if my body is dying. And she was feeling some distress. And a few hours later we got a phone call that her daughter had passed away. And that was the psychological umbilical in which she felt the transmission of the struggle of transition in her daughter without realizing what it was. And then it passed. Just after that it was over. So the psychological umbilicals can be very messy to deal with. And when we have close relationships, these can form strongly enough that in the separation, as in a divorce, you literally have a ripping apart, a tearing taking place in the energy cord, which leads to a kind of a bleeding in the subtle body. There's a wound which takes time to heal. Although the material is plastic, there's still a wound. And similarly, when somebody very close to us has passed on, at that level of the cord, if we have not consciously softened or loosened it, there can be the sense of a loss and the pang of grief that comes with it. And all of this really then has to be dealt with by conscious internal process of awareness. You recognize it for what it is and address it at the level at which it occurs. So if it is an emotional bond that has been torn, well, you deal with the emotions in you by softening, relaxing, letting go, bringing peace, clarity, light, or love into that part which is wounded, and allowing the healing to take place rapidly, and letting go rather than clinging on. I miss this person so much, and what are you doing? You're reaching out and clinging on. Instead, you make the conscious, but it has to be done on that level. You cannot solve this problem by hitting on other levels, which is what people end up doing often. You talk to a person, no, it's okay, they have passed on, they are happy. Yeah, but I am not. So you have to deal with it here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. I'm going to switch the topic a little bit
Mhm.
to something, it's still related to healing. In the U.S., I would love to, there's something called scalar energy.
Mhm.
And I would love to know what the equivalent is in the way that you see it. It's been recently proposed that in heart waves, that it is the T wave part of it, of the, what is it, PQRST.
Mhm.
And the T is the type of the wave within the heart rhythm that has actually the umbilical cord to us all in a oneness.
Okay.
And I would love to know what your feeling is on that. And scalar energy is something kind of unique, at least from our point of view, but we don't really know that much about it.
Is this something which is a vocabulary used to describe a phenomenon, or is it something measured?
Well, we don't have, it's
Okay.
supposedly not
Yes.
electromagnetic
Yes.
and not
Yes.
electrical. We
Yes,
don't
okay,
know.
okay. So I think it's just a way, like we use analogies from quantum mechanics to describe connections through entanglement. We're using a term scalar energy in a context which is really an analogy rather than a physical reality. Scalar energy in physics or in electronics, electromagnetism, represents a particular form of energy in which you cannot measure the electromagnetic pulse, and yet there's an energy which is beamed, and it's able to cross through the normal barriers to electromagnetic energy. And what's interesting is you can do it quite easily. You take one electromagnetic pulse and put an opposite electromagnetic pulse together with it so that the electromagnetic fields neutralize, but the energy itself is beamed through without an electromagnetic field. And this is supposed to be the weapons of the future, which have been developed, in fact, in many secret government projects, which are used also sometimes, etc. But once you speak of pure energy without electromagnetic content, then the analogy is now transferred to things like this of the heartbeat and so on. I would say that to turn an analogy or a vocabulary into a physical reality is sometimes risky. The actual connection with another person is on the energy body and not of the physical heartbeat itself. And so to say that the heartbeat has a scalar component wouldn't make sense to me. But if that satisfies a reductionist scientist's mindset, it would be a way to convey an idea to him, but it would still not represent the reality. Because I could stop my heartbeat, hold my awareness, and still feel the emotional connection, right?
Yes. There's, perhaps it's more than placebo, but there are people offering this scalar energy as pulse waves and having miraculous healings. So I was just sort of wondering in the framework of
Yes. So it's possible that we have miraculous healings from many kinds of things. The mother gives a very interesting example. She said, if in certain kinds of illness, where there's this complex element of the mind's belief involved, if you give the person a series of very precise instructions to follow, which will lead to the cure, and they follow it meticulously, often they end up with a cure. And it's a way by which that part of the mind's faith has been engaged, which was the root cause of the problem. So there are many things like that, devices which may actually have an energy influence, but the healing itself is taking place more from the aspect of the faith, accepting that as the occasion for being healed. Yes, sure.
With the technique of Vipassana, we were speaking earlier of the physicalized form, and I'm wanting to understand a little bit of the relationship of integral yoga, and one of the practices within Vipassana is that you go to such a minute level, to the cellular structure of the bone of the body, and then you sort of just breathe en masse that type of energy and connection, so that we sort of just become the breath of life. Is there, I had a more direct question, but I'm forgetting it now. Do you?
I think in general we had this discussion about, on one hand, the mother and Srila have spoken about bringing divinity all the way into ourselves. And we had this discussion about how, yes, and you have to bring yourself out of the body to connect with that divinity, to bring it back in. So we were musing on this and thinking about the process as we understand it at Vipassana, where you are holding the body in awareness, and by holding the body in awareness, but
Yes.
as I understand it, their teaching was very much focused on body sensation. So it's not like you're not focusing on body sensation. Would you see that approach as divergent from the
Every practice, every exercise can be beneficial for the specific result that it offers. In itself, Vipassana can be extremely useful to develop the basic relationship of separation between mind and body sensations. Okay? But it will not take more than that by itself. What it does is it puts you as a witness observer in the mind, observing body sensations and refusing to be identified with them, observing them as something happening, allowing them to happen, but you are unaffected. So you're creating the separation of witness to the body, gross body. In itself, it will not lead you to higher or deeper states of consciousness or bring a spiritual influence to the body itself. At most, what it could do is help to make the body more conscious, infuse something of the mind's awareness into the body sensations, but that's about all that it would do. It has a great utility for the mind's development or the mind's discovering its freedom, but it does not yet in itself lead to a spiritual change. Spiritual as being defined by a consciousness which knows the oneness, underlying oneness. And that's nowhere in the picture in this whole exercise. So it's useful, but it leads to that limited specific result, which is helpful for many people in any case. Shamini, do you want to, if you need to go for the Om choir, then you should leave now. Okay. Bye-bye. Okay. Yes. Bye-bye. See. We can continue. Yeah.
I heard the mother describe somewhere a person doing yoga and having an illness and a person just living an ordinary life having an illness.
Yes.
So somewhere she described that the ordinary person has an illness just by chance.
Yes.
And it has to be dealt with completely different than a person being
Yes.
seriously, deeply rooted in the yoga.
Yes.
Where the illness is an ignorance and at the same time the opportunity to work something out, right?
Uh-huh. Yes.
And then I always wonder if I would interfere. I mean,
So, to help someone, you mean? To help someone. You should in any case help. But the nature of the help will be determined by a deeper insight. If someone is ill, well, they should not be. They should get free of the illness. But you may also realize, coming from a deeper yoga perspective, that the illness has a cause that you are unable to engage with. If the person is practicing yoga, wants to be conscious, you may actually assist the person to become conscious of that to the extent they are ready for. But to the extent that they are not willing to face that, oh, within me there is such and such a tendency, and they're not willing to face it, you cannot do too much either. So you provide the support, help them gradually to get closer to that. But you can still invoke and pray for them, invoke a help, invoke a healing, ask for the dissolution of that knot. Knots can be dissolved without knowing them. And so why not? You should be able to do that also.
Shri talks about the inner vital
Mm-hmm.
are they part of subtle body or
Yes, yes. What we generally call subtle body consists of the inner mind, inner vital, inner physical. And that's the part which we are not normally conscious of. We are only conscious of the little bit of it which is represented in this physical body and the vital and mental part of the physical body. And it is this which is us and the evolving part. All the rest which is behind and with a gap of consciousness is holding the potential of this surface evolution and leaking out bit by bit its influence to assist in this development. So in the yoga, one of the important things which happens and should happen is to become conscious of these subtler layers of ourselves. Layers which are currently subliminal should become now in the liminal, should become conscious, and the interplay between them, which is very complex, to become conscious of that. And increasingly as you become conscious of something, you develop also control over it. When you're not conscious, you cannot change anything. But when you're conscious, you can restrain or amplify, modify, divert, and bit by bit acquire a control until you can on demand be able to exercise it the way you would exercise your hand. You can exercise a shift in consciousness within you or draw on certain abilities or powers or aspects of your inner consciousness into the outer. So the gap between the inner and outer begins to be bridged. And this is a necessary thing. And it reaches a stage when you are living not just as this gross body, you are aware of your entire subtle body and all the layers in between. This is me. And my gross body is a tiny part of this whole. And eventually when the consciousness opens out to something still wider, I am one with the whole and my body, gross body, is inside this larger consciousness, and one lives in that increasingly.
After all these that's higher discussion, I have a very small question and very crude question in this here. The things of beings which have consciousness, I can conceive. But things like earth or sun having consciousness, for me it's difficult to conceive.
Yes,
What are the
yes.
implications of these? Like,
Yes.
now earth
Yes.
is say Mother Earth.
Yes.
And whatever it gives us physically.
So you can look at it. Yes.
Consciousness.
Yes. So when you look at a person, can you know their thoughts? You see only the expression on their face or their words which reflect their thoughts. But if they conceal, you will not know what they are thinking or feeling. Okay? A flower is not even that much expressive because it cannot move as your face or your speech can. So your ability to perceive the conscious part of the flower is that much limited because you are not seeing its manifestation in the body, which is more rigid. Animal is somewhere in between. The dog is upset, you can see, but you don't know why it is upset because it's just the quality of the sound of its barking that tells you he's upset. At that point, if you have a close relationship with the dog, you will feel in the dog's bark why it is upset. Do you have a pet? No, okay. So that's one level at which one begins to sense that the reality of the person and the expression of the person are so different, and we can feel, we can access that deeper reality. So the same thing happens with the flowers. So these are, I'm giving these examples because they are more accessible to us. But once we have glimpsed this truth, then we can begin to feel it also in relation to earth and the sun. But one easy way to develop that sensitivity is to feel love and embrace with love the earth or the sun. Love has the special character that it leads inevitably to some form of identification. What you love, you begin to identify with. And as that identification grows, you begin to feel that the sun is a conscious presence, that it has something much more profound. And you begin to feel and experience it. And that's one way you can develop. But once you understand this analogy of the dog or the flower, who don't have the capacity to express, and yet have the experience of something internally, you will get the truth of it, at least in understanding. Yes, yes. So she's giving the example where Mother said that make friends with the sun. And it changes your relationship with the sunlight and the heat of the sun and so on. Afterwards, you don't feel anymore the heat as uncomfortable. You feel it almost like a loving embrace, which is warm but not uncomfortable anymore. And that's an experience one can develop quite easily. You stand before the sun and open your heart, open your mind, and as if meeting a friend, just feel the loving embrace to the sun. And give yourself in that embrace. And you will feel already a shift after a while. And if you do it a few times, the relationship strengthens and stabilizes enough that afterwards you will not find the heat oppressive or uncomfortable. Yes, yes. You can build the same with the rain. Then you don't need the umbrella. Yes.
Could you talk about the different methods of healing and which are most in consonant with the yoga? I mean, for example, you said about plant qualities and then applying them, that is one way, but there could be also identifying with the patient and then
Yes.
healing it oneself, passing on the vibration and building different ways.
Yes. So, depending on which level the root knot of the illness is, you will have to access that level or multiple levels where the illness may have spread. For example, a person may have in the mind and emotions, in the borderline between them, a sense of a deep depression. They may not even be conscious of it. which eventually will settle, coalesce into a rigid form in the gross body as tuberculosis. Mother refers to this as one of the forms in which the depression appears. You have to treat the tuberculosis anyway. But if you don't treat the root cause, then you may find that the tuberculosis recurs. Or the depression now emerges in a different form of illness, more specific to and more rigid perhaps than the TB. On the other hand, if you were able to address the root cause in the psychological condition, the physical tuberculosis might get healed of its own without needing any specific medication. In certain very sticky cases, you may need to address both at the same time if you want to resolve it. So, I'm not discussing now the physical means. Where necessary, you use it. Infuse into it the right intention and the factor X as far as possible. Okay, so if the doctor is giving you the medicine, if the doctor says, okay, try this out, maybe it will work, most likely it won't work. If the doctor says, here, this will cure you, it has cured everybody, this is the most miraculous medicine, take, tomorrow you'll be well. You see the energy he puts, that will have a huge effect. Now if he can put a positive energy, you can also. You take the medicine, invoke the divine presence, put into it the intention that you want, of the effect it will have, and take it consciously. Or if you are the caregiver to someone who's sick, you put that conscious intention, invoke the mother's force, and then give the medication. So even if you're using physical medication, you can bring this deeper dimension. If you have to access other levels to help heal the person, then you have to be a little more careful. Because on the subtler levels, any connection is two-way. You could just as easily catch an infection if your vitality is weaker than theirs. Their infection or their illness can jump into you. Or you're trying to heal an illness which is, let's say, related to some specific thing, but they may have other problems such as habits of anger which bounce into your energy because your energy is weaker than theirs. The moment you connect it to help them on an energetic level, their junk flowed into you without you realizing it. So on those levels, I would be generally very wary. Unless the patient is already someone very close to you as a family member with whom there's already plenty of energy exchange taking place, or unless your body and life energy is sufficiently strong to be able to do such things. I would rather recommend, in such cases where you are not able to do that, invoke the mother's force with whatever intention, prayer or form of intention that you find most helpful, for those levels also, even as you do for the physical medication that you give. And that is often the most direct and rapid help that you can provide. It used to be when someone was ill and they would write to the mother would send her force and the person would get well. Sometimes there was a sticky problem or the person was not receptive and the mother would sense it and she would tell the person who had sent the message to be the link point. And she would say, I will put the force through you, because the patient was more open to them than to the mother. And we have to recognize these things. So the person may be trusting you, but you still invoke the mother's force to act directly on him rather than trying to engage with your energy, which may be not sufficient or may be dangerous for you.
And what about those invoking doctors or healers that have passed away but are still in their subtle bodies and all these things, and nature spirits?
If in any case you're invoking a subtle or spiritual help, then the best is to stay with the one source which is the source of all, the Divine Mother, the Divine Shakti, which in any case is one and infinite. And she can do everything without needing the secondary and tertiary reflections of her action. On the other hand, if you were to invoke 2 or 3 different sources, it may even lead to more confusion if they are not harmonized and they are limited, finite sources. And they can often get into some kind of internal conflict in their action. And it makes your work that much more complex and difficult. Recognizing that every source of energy eventually goes back to the one source, invoke that directly. It's much more effective. And that can work in a multifaceted action and on multiple levels for the most rapid cure.
I don't know, I'm not sure if I've read anything in Mother Shobhita, but I have experienced that dogs or horses, they can take on
Yes.
a disease which is originating from me, and they work it out for me. It can even lead to the death of the animal.
Yes.
I have experienced that, and I find this incredibly extraordinary, and such an expression of love. I'm quite
Yes.
overwhelmed by it sometimes. I
Yes.
see it actually not only with myself,
Yes.
but with other people also who have
Yes. Yes.
say something about
And often they may not even do it with the idea of doing it, but just out of the love with which they embrace you, and they just absorb and take your pain. Even if you're unhappy and sad, the dog will come and try to cheer you up. And sometimes they instinctively, because they love you so much, they just suck your sadness and hold it in them. They get unhappy and you somehow feel relieved. So these things happen quite a bit. Even among human beings, we tend to do that in relationships of deep love. And typically a mother does that to her child when she embraces the child who's sick. Instinctively she is absorbing the illness and the child is giving it up and gets relieved, and her body, being more strong, is able to digest and get rid of the illness more quickly. But it is the same with animals in the relationships of love. Yes.
I tell you something about Janda the mother, about pranayama. Recently, I listened mother, long time I don't listen this aspect of mother talk about with Satran about pranayama. For example, when you repeat the mantra of the mother, Om Namo, the Supreme, and also I read 2 weeks ago Raja Yoga and Pranayama, synthesis of yoga. And Shobhita express, especially when you call the Supreme, when you do Hatha Yoga or Pranayama, you realize something and clean your body, some disease. It's very true.
Yes.
Recently, I have a little small accident in my leg, and every morning I do pranayama and hatha yoga. And I tell you, really, I prefer my body now, not when I have 20. Alors, but depends your connection with the Supreme, with Mother or Shobhita.
Yes.
Depends your connection.
Yes.
It's very, very, very important, this aspect.
Yes.
But it cleans something when you call.
Yes.
When
True.
I tell you, Mother said also in Ajanda, the body discusses with you, talk with you. A lot like discuss, it's very, very, very interesting. I just want to tell,
Yes.
just simply, but, not,
Right.
but it's incredible. I will clean the body,
True.
that's all. Without any
Yes.
medicine, anything, just offer God.
This touches upon a very important aspect of the spiritualization, or let's say the awakening of the body consciousness. When you're sitting, let's say, in a quiet meditation, and you receive the descent of the force of the Shakti in whatever form, the part in which it is received is the part which is quiet. So often you get up and start moving rapidly, you tend to lose what you received. Precisely in the movement, you do not have the receptivity anymore, and in the parts which are moving, you do not have it, or in the state which is of activity, you cannot hold. And Mother considered it extremely important that we should develop the same receptivity in the movement in life. And eventually what you receive in concentration with the body still must extend into every activity of life without exception. In what the vocabulary Sri Aurobindo uses is in the dynamic parts. Now, dynamic parts includes the moving energies, life energies, the muscles when they are in movement, and in the act of movement itself. Everything in the body should be able to hold and continue with the same clarity and intensity what was held in a state of stillness. And so if this work is done, then you have it as a permanent realization. But specifically, certain activities of the body would relate to certain levels of consciousness. So for example, you mentioned the breathing. When you are breathing and you connect either the feeling or the relation with the force, with the breath, then it links very clearly to the life force. Because breath, physical breath, is linked to the taking in and out of the life energy. And so when you do it with that intention, consciously breathe in the presence, and you breathe out into the presence, and breathe in the presence, and breathe out. You are merging the experience or the relation of the divine presence with the life force, and particularly its most physical layer. And so if you take every activity of life as an indication, eventually it covers all these fine gradations and all the parts of your being and brings it into the experience. It changes something at a very deep level in the physical consciousness. So we had an interesting discussion from which we will go back to the discussion of the theme of our study, which is in the chapter on the soul and nature. And we will take that up next Friday. To close this discussion which we had particularly about healing and health, remember the power which forms your body, which leads it through all the evolution, is the Divine Mother's. The power which nourishes and sustains your body is finally the Divine Mother's. Even if you're looking at food and other sources, they're all indirectly representations from the same source. And so as those who are in a spiritual life, we have to consciously turn and align every part of ourself to the Divine Shakti, including the parts which are ill or not well or weak or whatever it is, less developed. The more we are able to align and turn those parts to her, the more directly she can act to accelerate their strengthening, their development, their healing, their evolution, whatever is required. And so Sri Aurobindo has a pretty radical statement regarding this. He says, drugs often cure the body when they do not merely trouble or poison it, but only if their physical attack on the disease is supported by the force of the spirit. If that force can be made to work freely, drugs are at once superfluous. At once. If that force can be made to work freely, drugs are at once superfluous, not gradually, at once. The moment this free action takes place, you do not need the drugs anymore. To the extent that you do not have the free action, well, you have all these indirect needs and reliances. So a few things of this nature. We ought to use the divine health in us to cure and prevent diseases. But Galen and Hippocrates and their tribe, that is the modern doctors, have given us instead an armory of drugs and a barbarous Latin hocus pocus as our physical gospel. You can see how dismissive he is in that statement. But that's the reality. The problem is we are already stuck in that, to some degree, in that hocus pocus and the physical gospel. But if we can make this alignment, and to the extent that we can make this alignment, you will find you will not need it, and the working of the health will automatically grow. Where you find persistence of a knot in your health, know that it represents a part which is not open to the mother's force, and then work upon it in that way. Use the support of medicine as required, but work upon it to awaken it to the force. So this doesn't mean you stop medicine and then say, I will now rely only on the force. You have to assess objectively what your condition is and be able to act on all these levels as needed. But from the perspective of the yoga, the force has the power to do everything, to the extent that we open and align ourselves to her. Om.